April 17, 1975. The streets of Phnom Penh erupted in celebration. Black-clad soldiers poured through the gates of Cambodia's capital, and the people greeted them with cheers. After 5 years of civil war, after the bombs and bloodshed, peace had finally arrived. Families waved white flags from their balconies. Children ran alongside the trucks carrying young revolutionary fighters, their faces painted with relief. The nightmare, they believed, was over. They were wrong. Within 48 hours, those same streets would be empty. The hospitals cleared, their patients dragged from operating tables, schools abandoned mid-lesson, books left open on desks. Every single resident of the city, from newborn infants to the elderly confined to beds, was ordered into the countryside. Soldiers moved door to door, rifles slung over their shoulders, shouting that American bombs were coming. This was a lie. There were no bombs. What followed instead was something far more devastating. Between 1975 and 1979, the Khmer Rouge regime under Pol Pot transformed Cambodia into a graveyard. Nearly 2 million people, roughly a quarter of the entire population, perished. They died in labor camps, in torture chambers, in mass graves scattered across the countryside. This was the Cambodian Genocide, one of the 20th century's darkest chapters, and it began with a simple phrase that would haunt the nation for generations: Year Zero. The man who orchestrated this catastrophe was born Saloth Sar, likely in 1925, though some records suggest 1928 in a small village in rural Cambodia. He would later adopt the name Pol Pot, though the exact origin of this pseudonym remains uncertain. Some scholars suggest it may derive from politique potentielle, political potential, while others believe it was simply chosen to obscure his identity. Educated and relatively privileged, he received a scholarship to study in France in the early 1950s, where he encountered the radical communist circles that would shape his ideology. Paris in the post-war years buzzed with revolutionary fervor, and young intellectuals debated Marx, Lenin, and Stalin late into the night. Saloth Sar absorbed these ideas with fervor, but it was Maoism that truly captivated him. Later, after failing his exams and returning to Cambodia, he traveled to China and witnessed the Cultural Revolution firsthand. What he saw there became his blueprint. Mao's vision of peasant revolution, of purging society of intellectuals and capitalist influence, resonated deeply. But Saloth Sar believed previous communist experiments had failed because they hadn't gone far enough. They had compromised, maintained some old structures, allowed some remnants of the past to linger. He would make no such mistake. In Cambodia, he envisioned something purer, more radical, more complete. A total transformation of society, starting from nothing. By the early 1960s, Saloth Sar had risen to lead Cambodia's underground Communist Party, which would become known as the Khmer Rouge. The name, meaning Red Khmers, was coined by Cambodia's ruler, Prince Norodom Sihanouk, to describe the disparate communist guerrillas operating in the jungle. Throughout the 1960s, these forces remained weak and scattered. But everything changed in 1970 when a military coup overthrew Sihanouk and installed a pro-American general named Lon Nol. The United States, deeply entangled in the Vietnam War next door, began secretly bombing Cambodia's countryside to target Vietnamese communist forces hiding there. Between 1969 and 1973, American B-52s dropped an estimated 500,000 tons of bombs on Cambodian soil. Though some scholars suggest the total may have been even higher, villages disappeared. Rice paddies turned to craters, and the Khmer Rouge, once a marginal force, swelled with recruits. Peasants who had lost everything to American bombs joined the revolution. The chaos of civil war gave Pol Pot exactly what he needed. By 1975, the Khmer Rouge controlled most of the countryside. Lon Nol's government, corrupt and depleted, could barely hold the capital. On that April morning, when the black-clad soldiers finally entered Phnom Penh, they arrived as victors. But their victory would become Cambodia's nightmare. Year Zero. The phrase was never officially declared by the Khmer Rouge themselves, but it perfectly captured their ideology. Everything that existed before April 17, 1975, was to be erased. History would begin again. Cambodia, now renamed Democratic Kampuchea, would become a pure agrarian society, untainted by Western corruption, money, education, or religion. Pol Pot believed Cambodian society had been poisoned by foreign influence, particularly by capitalism and intellectualism. To create his vision of a classless communist utopia, he would need to destroy every trace of the old world. This meant the cities had to be emptied. Urban life itself was considered corrupt, a breeding ground for bourgeois thinking. The Khmer Rouge viewed city dwellers with suspicion and contempt. They were the new people, tainted by Western ways as opposed to the old people, the rural peasants who formed the revolutionary base. Within days of taking Phnom Penh, soldiers began the evacuation. They told residents that American bombing was imminent and that everyone needed to leave for their own safety. They promised it would be temporary, just 3 days. But there was no bombing and there would be no return. The evacuation was brutal and immediate. Hospitals were cleared first. Patients still recovering from surgery, mothers who had given birth hours earlier, people on intravenous drips, all were forced into the streets. Those who couldn't walk were abandoned or shot. Doctors pleading to stay with critical patients were beaten or executed on the spot. One surgeon later recalled being marched from the operating room, his gloves still bloody, as his patient bled out on the table behind him. The elderly, many of whom had never left the city in their lives, were herded onto roads already packed with humanity. Some families managed to stay together. Others were separated immediately, children torn from parents, husbands from wives. The roads leading out of Phnom Penh became rivers of people. The city's population, swollen by war refugees to somewhere between 2 and 3 million residents, streaming into the countryside with whatever they could carry. No vehicles were permitted. Everyone walked. The heat was merciless. The roads crowded beyond belief. People collapsed from exhaustion, dehydration, panic. The bodies of those who fell were left where they lay, trampled by those behind them. Khmer Rouge soldiers lined the route, rifles ready, shouting orders. Anyone who questioned, anyone who slowed, anyone who complained was pulled aside. Some were beaten, some simply disappeared. And this wasn't just Phnom Penh. Every city in Cambodia was emptied. Every town, every village that showed signs of urban development. The Khmer Rouge had been implementing similar evacuations in territories they captured throughout the Civil War, but never on this scale. Factories were shuttered, markets closed, schools and universities locked. The Khmer Rouge dismantled the infrastructure of modern life with shocking speed. Money was abolished, private property seized, religion banned outright. Buddhist monks, once revered in Cambodian society, were defrocked and forced into labor or executed. Pagodas were demolished or turned into warehouses. Family bonds were severed. The regime considered loyalty to family a threat because it competed with loyalty to Angkar, the organization. The faceless collective authority of the Khmer Rouge children were separated from their parents and placed in communal labor brigades. Marriages were arranged by the state. People were not allowed to choose their own partners, their own clothes, or even when to eat. Every aspect of life was regulated by Angkar. Those who arrived at the countryside found no welcome. They were herded into hastily organized collective farms where they were expected to grow rice to feed the revolution. But there was no plan, no preparation, no tools. The irrigation systems were primitive or non-existent. The soil in many areas was unsuitable for rice cultivation, and the quotas set by Pol Pot were impossibly high. He wanted Cambodia to double its rice production immediately, convinced that sheer revolutionary will could overcome agricultural reality. Life in the labor camps was slow death. People worked from before dawn until after dark, digging canals, planting rice, harvesting with primitive tools under the watch of teenage soldiers. The Khmer Rouge recruited heavily from rural youth, indoctrinating them with propaganda and turning them into enforcers. These young guards, often barely into their teens, held absolute power over the lives of those they supervised. Starvation set in quickly. Rations were minimal, usually just a thin rice gruel that barely kept people alive. Those who were caught foraging for food, even picking wild fruits or catching insects, could be executed. The regime believed that any act of self-sufficiency undermined collective discipline. Disease spread unchecked. Malaria, dysentery, cholera. There were no doctors, no medicine, no hospitals. The Khmer Rouge had systematically killed or driven away anyone with medical training. Traditional healers were all that remained, and even they worked in secret, terrified of being accused of practicing old ways. Families that had managed to stay together were torn apart. Husbands and wives were assigned to different work units. Children were sent to mobile youth brigades, told that Angkar was their true parent now. At night, the camps held indoctrination sessions where people were forced to confess their past sins, their connections to the old regime, their education, their thoughts. Any confession could be used against you, and silence was equally dangerous. But the labor camps, as horrific as they were, weren't the worst of what the Khmer Rouge created. For those accused of being enemies of the revolution, there was Tuol Sleng before the war. It had been a high school. Classrooms filled with students learning geometry and literature. By 1976, it had become Security Prison 21, or S21, the most notorious torture center in Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge converted the school buildings into a labyrinth of interrogation rooms and cells. Barbed wire was strung across the balconies to prevent prisoners from committing suicide by jumping. Classrooms were subdivided into tiny brick cells, each barely large enough for a person to lie down. Between 1975 and 1979, estimates suggest between 14,000 and 20,000 people passed through S21. The exact number remains uncertain because some records were destroyed or taken by Vietnamese forces. What is certain is this: only 12 people are known to have survived, 7 adults and 5 children found when Vietnamese troops liberated the prison in 1979. The prison held what the regime called special enemies. These were members of the Khmer Rouge's own ranks who fell under suspicion. Intellectuals, former government officials, foreigners unlucky enough to be in Cambodia when the revolution began. Paranoia within the Khmer Rouge leadership was rampant. As agricultural production failed to meet impossible quotas, Pol Pot and his inner circle blamed saboteurs. Hidden agents working for Vietnam or the CIA purges swept through the party. Anyone could be denounced. Entire families were arrested under the policy of guilt by association. If one person was accused, their spouse, children, even distant relatives were brought to S21. The commander of S21 was a former school teacher named Choeung Ek, known as Douche. He was methodical, meticulous, almost scholarly in his approach to torture. Under his supervision, S21 kept detailed records of every prisoner. Each arrival was photographed, usually multiple times. Those photographs, thousands of them, still exist today. Faces staring at the camera, some defiant, some terrified, some already broken. Children, elderly, women holding infants, all meticulously documented before their suffering began. The interrogators used a range of techniques to extract confessions: electric shocks, waterboarding, beating with clubs and iron bars, fingernails pulled out with pliers, the wounds doused in alcohol. Prisoners were hung upside down until they passed out, then revived and hung again. Women were sexually assaulted despite official policy against it, and those guards caught doing so were themselves executed. Though this did little to stop the practice, the goal was always the same: force the prisoner to confess. It didn't matter if the confession was true. People admitted to working for the CIA, to being Vietnamese spies, to plotting against Angkar. They named accomplices, often people they had never met, just to make the pain stop. These confessions were carefully typed up, signed, and filed away. Evidence of counter-revolutionary activity, proof that the purges were justified. But S21 was not an execution site. It was a holding facility, a place where enemies were processed before their final destination. That destination was Choeung Ek, a former long-gone orchard about 17 kilometers south of Phnom Penh today. It's known simply as the Killing Fields. 2 or 3 times a month, trucks would arrive at S21 after dark. Guards would tell prisoners they were being relocated to a new facility. This was a lie designed to keep them compliant. Blindfolded and bound, 20 to 30 prisoners at a time were loaded into trucks and driven through the night to Choeung Ek. When they arrived, they were herded into a small building, a storage shed that served as a holding area. There was no pretense here. No more lies. This was an extermination site. Its only purpose was killing. The Khmer Rouge executed prisoners with chilling efficiency. Bullets were considered too expensive to waste on enemies of the state. Instead, they used whatever tools were at hand: hoes, axes, iron bars, sharpened bamboo stakes. Prisoners were led to the edge of mass graves, pits dug before their arrival. Often, they were forced to dig these graves themselves. Then, with a blow to the back of the head, they were killed and pushed into the pit. For children, the method was even more brutal. Soldiers grasped infants and toddlers by the legs and smashed their heads against the trunks of trees. One tree at Choeung Ek became infamous, later dubbed the killing tree, its bark embedded with fragments of bone and tissue. The grounds of Choeung Ek are dotted with mass graves, 129 in total, though only 86 have been excavated. The rest remain untouched, sealed under earth and grass. When archaeologists first opened these graves in 1980, they found the remains of nearly 9,000 bodies, though estimates suggest at least 17,000 people were killed at this single location. During the rainy season, bones still surface. Fragments of skull, teeth, scraps of clothing push up through the soil, grim reminders that even now, the dead refuse to be forgotten. A memorial stupa stands at the center of the site today, a Buddhist shrine made of glass and filled with human skulls. Over 5,000 of them, arranged by age and gender, many showing clear signs of trauma fractures from iron tools, holes from pickaxes. The evidence is unmistakable. These people were murdered with brutal, deliberate violence, and Choeung Ek was just one site among hundreds. Across Cambodia, more than 20,000 mass grave locations have been identified. Through extensive documentation efforts by organizations like the Documentation Center of Cambodia, over 1.38 million bodies have been mapped in these sites, providing physical evidence of the genocide's staggering scope. The true number may be even higher. Many killing fields remain unmarked, known only to the local villagers who live nearby and remember what happened in those fields and forests. Who were the victims? Anyone could become a target under the Khmer Rouge, but certain groups were singled out with particular ferocity. Intellectuals topped the list: doctors, lawyers, teachers, engineers. Anyone with higher education was considered a threat. The regime believed educated people had been corrupted by Western ideas and would resist the revolution. Even wearing glasses could mark you as an intellectual and seal your fate. The Khmer Rouge targeted anyone who spoke foreign languages or had traveled abroad. Ethnic and religious minorities faced systematic persecution. The Vietnamese population in Cambodia was almost entirely wiped out. The Chinese community, traditionally involved in commerce and trade, was decimated. The Cham people, a Muslim minority, suffered genocide within the genocide. Between 70% and 80% of the Cham population was exterminated. Buddhist monks were defrocked, humiliated, and killed by the thousands. Former government officials, soldiers, and police from the Lon Nol regime were hunted down. Even low-level bureaucrats were executed. But the paranoia extended far beyond these obvious enemies. As the regime's failures mounted, as starvation spread and rice production fell short of impossible quotas, the purges turned inward. Khmer Rouge members began denouncing each other. Regional commanders were accused of sabotage. Entire military units were disarmed and marched to S-21. The revolution, in its desperate attempt to purify itself, consumed its own. By late 1978, the Khmer Rouge had turned its paranoid fury outward. Border clashes with Vietnam escalated into open warfare. Pol Pot believed Cambodia could defeat its larger neighbor through revolutionary zeal alone. He was wrong. On December 25, 1978, Vietnamese forces launched a full-scale invasion. The Khmer Rouge, weakened by years of internal purges and the devastation of its own population, collapsed quickly. By January 7, 1979, Vietnamese troops entered Phnom Penh. The nightmare was over, or so it seemed. Pol Pot and his top commanders fled into the jungles along the Thai border, where they would continue guerrilla warfare for nearly 2 more decades. The Khmer Rouge retained Cambodia's seat at the United Nations until 1982. Incredibly recognized by many nations as the legitimate government despite the genocide, Vietnam installed a new government, but it took years before the full scale of the atrocities became known to the outside world. Journalists who entered Cambodia after the liberation found cities still empty, their streets overgrown with vegetation. They found S-21 with its meticulous records intact. They found the killing fields, the bones, the evidence of systematic mass murder. Yet justice remained elusive. Pol Pot was never tried for his crimes. He died in 1998 while under house arrest, imposed not by international authorities but by his own followers during an internal power struggle. He was 73 years old and never expressed remorse. It wasn't until 2006 that the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, a UN-backed tribunal, began holding trials for surviving Khmer Rouge leaders. In 2010, Duch, the commander of S-21, was convicted of crimes against humanity and sentenced to life in prison. He died in 2020. 2 other senior leaders, Nuon Chea and Khieu Samphan, were convicted of genocide in 2018. But these convictions came more than 3 decades after the regime's fall. Most perpetrators lived and died without facing accountability. And the survivors, those who endured the labor camps, the torture, the loss of their families, continue to grapple with trauma that words can barely express. The scars of the Khmer Rouge remain visible across Cambodia today. An entire generation of educated professionals was wiped out, creating a knowledge gap that took decades to rebuild. The psychological wounds run even deeper. Survivor testimonies speak of nightmares that never end, of guilt for outliving loved ones, of a society still processing collective trauma. Yet Cambodia has also shown remarkable resilience. The Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum and the Choeung Ek Memorial Site stand as places of remembrance and education. Survivors share their stories with visitors from around the world, ensuring that what happened is not forgotten. The Cambodian Genocide stands as a stark reminder of what happens when ideology becomes more important than humanity. When the desire to create a perfect society overrides basic human rights. When paranoia and purges replace reason and mercy. Nearly 2 million people died because one man believed he could reshape an entire nation by erasing its past and starting from zero. He couldn't. What he created instead was a graveyard, a nation of survivors carrying memories too painful to forget. The glass stupa at Choeung Ek, filled with skulls, stands as testament to their suffering. The photographs at Tuol Sleng, thousands of faces staring back at visitors, demand that we remember. These were real people, teachers, farmers, parents, children. Each one had a name, a story, a life cut short by violence. The world watched as Cambodia burned, and for too long, we did nothing. The lessons of Year Zero remain urgent. Genocide doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It begins with dehumanization, with dividing people into us and them, with leaders who promise purity and perfection while building machines of death. It happens when the international community turns away, when justice is delayed, when survivors are left to rebuild alone. If you found this history as haunting as it is essential, leave a comment below. Tell us what moved you, what shocked you, what you'll remember. And if you want to explore more of these dark corners of history, the stories that textbooks often skip, subscribe to The Codex of History, because some truths, no matter how painful, deserve to be told, and some voices, no matter how long silenced, deserve to be heard.